Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and LEAP, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test school and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is admissions notes for the high school graduating class of 2026. But first, let's meet our special guest, Rebecca Stuart-Orlowski.
Rebecca Stuart-Orlowski is the founder of Orlowski College Consulting and has worked in education for 35 years and has worked as an independent educational consultant for more than 10 years. She has a specialized certificate in college counseling from UC San Diego, a BA in Communicative Disorders from San Diego State, and 2 active teaching credentials. She taught deaf, LD, and 2E students for 4 years and was a college counselor at a small private school for 3 years. Rebecca specializes in gifted 2E STEM creative homeschooled and transfer students. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on again. This is exciting. It's our 4th year doing this.
It is exciting, right? This is the 4th year we are doing admissions notes for a high school graduating class. We started with 2023, we did 2024, the class of 2025, and now we are turning our attention to the graduating class of 2026. Now, it's fair to say that families who really loved those previous episodes might not have had students in this particular graduating class, so they might not know you, Rebecca. So can you please, before we dive into this fascinating topic, talk a bit about yourself and your practice?
Sure, I would love to. So I am actually starting my 14th cycle as an independent educational consultant. And as Amy mentioned, I do focus on highly and profoundly gifted kids, homeschool students, transfer students, but also I've kind of come to specialize in students who take sort of non-traditional paths. So students who switch educational settings, students who might be on their 2nd or 3rd attempt to, rejoin college or stay in college. So I really have a heart for helping any student find a way forward. And that comes from both professional and personal experience. So I really love not taking no for an answer for any of my students. And anything that's new about me, I'm having shoulder surgery in 2 weeks. So I'm going to be taking about a month off. So this is good timing for us to do this now.
When we're done talking, I'll share some tips for surviving that that experience.
Please do, Mike. Yes, please do. I'm open to any and all tips.
Well, let's just dive in because you've come up with some really great questions for us to talk about. And some of these are some topics Mike and I have been either talking about amongst ourselves, between ourselves, or things that we've heard in kind of larger admissions world. But so share with our audience, they might not be familiar, but there's something called the enrollment cliff that is coming or is here. And so if you could tell us, what is the enrollment cliff? Is it real? And what does it mean for the students who are going to be in the class of 2026?
Yes, the enrollment cliff. I mean, I know that you guys have heard about it for a while. Basically, what it means is that there will be fewer students graduating from high schools. I mean, there are just fewer students, fewer children being born. Therefore, this next fall is sort of the beginning of the enrollment cliff. But, what does that actually mean? So, when I was talking to my class of 2025 students, I had to, share the bad news that, your class had the most students applying to college. So that meant admit rates are the lowest. So, the question is, how bad is this enrollment cliff and what does it mean for, students in the class of 2026 who are graduating high school?
Could you say first, what does it mean for colleges? Like, tell us what do you think it means for colleges, and then maybe put it in perspective for students.
Right. I think what it means for colleges is that they've got to get more creative. And to be honest, it's not it's not like falling off a deep cliff. It's going to be a slow decline. So for colleges, if they're wise, they're going to plan ahead for that. They're going to get creative. They're going to figure out how to entice students to their schools. They have to be more relevant. That's a huge discussion in higher education. Is a college education still relevant? All of us agree. Yeah, we think it is. But I think, it's really more of an enrollment slide. So I think they really need to um, figure out how to perhaps reinvent themselves and how to really, pursue students and show students that, what they are offering is valuable.
The thing is, and we spoke not long ago with John Marcus of the Hechinger Report to talk about the demographic cliff and, all of the implications. But colleges have had time to prepare for that. What they haven't expected is the double whammy of declining domestic population along with declining international
Right.
interest in colleges. So, Rebecca, what do you
Right.
think about that fact that, you can prepare for one disaster at a time,
Not
but
seeing the other one
when
coming.
two different ones hit at the same time,
Right.
are there enough plans to put in place to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And the answer is probably, not necessarily, particularly maybe for colleges, smaller colleges. I think we saw a lot of closures this past year, and I imagine, based on everything that I'm reading, that we'll continue to see the closures of smaller colleges. But I think colleges have to look at other populations to draw from. So, for instance, I was talking in my community about the fact that a lot of colleges are looking to re-enroll adult college students who have, stepped away. I think that's a brilliant move, and I think that more colleges should do that. I think that's a great population, and I think that's one way that they can bolster their enrollment is to go after those adult students. So again, they need to be creative about this.
Well, I've even noticed
So
some dual enrollment programs, more colleges offering dual enrollment, which obviously then is tapping into kids in high school taking classes. Yeah.
Absolutely, sort of to bring them along, to let them know that you're going to be getting credit and, maybe you don't need to spend 4 years in college, or you're going to get a little more bang for your buck. It's going to be a little more affordable. Yeah. So, and I see this, I've even heard of colleges actually, pursuing, students whose GPA may have led them to withdraw or something like that. They're offering them a second chance. So I have a real heart for that population because I do believe in second and third chances. So, Mike, in answer to your question, even if the demographics here, and abroad are dropping, I still think there are plenty of people, students, both, young and older, who can fill these spaces in colleges. Just I would say, I'm thinking back when my middle son applied to college, that was back in fall of, 2014. So it was about 10 years ago. A lot of the schools like University of Pennsylvania, where he initially went, they didn't even take transfer students. Like they didn't take, community college transfer credits or transfer students. So, the successful colleges are really, opening their minds to more possibilities.
from the perspective of the graduating class of 2026, does this demographic shift and international inertia mean that it's a buyer's market, that there is an advantage to students who are graduating high school next year, or will it still be business as usual at the selective levels?
A great question. I would say it's possibly going to lean into a buyer's market a little bit, not necessarily for those same top 50 schools that, so many of the strongest students apply to, but certainly maybe in what we might call the quote unquote second tier colleges. I believe so. I think that we will see a little bit more of a buyer's market. But one of our other questions today is going to address that it's not just an assumption. Like you can't just assume that's what's going to happen. So yeah.
So as far as colleges go, are you noticing any trends as far as popularity, like colleges that have become more popular, or maybe colleges that have become less popular with students?
Yes, I mean, it's really fun to see the trends, and I think a lot of people are maybe surprised, but one of the more Unusual trends is, the increased popularity of Southern colleges.
I was wondering if that was you're going to say, because we're seeing it here in Ohio. Colleges that I've not that I've never heard of, but the colleges that I would never have seen students going to, it's looking so different, right? Our southern part of the country, those institutions. But you're seeing that from your neck of the woods.
Absolutely not. And I do work with students all over the country and all over the world, but absolutely, yeah, Southern colleges, and there are a lot of reasons for it, right? So the weather is, glorious. The school spirit, I think a lot of students really kind of love that, the big football games and stuff like that. And then affordability. A lot of these schools, like for instance, schools in Texas, if you earn even like $1,000 scholarship, say at like, University of North Texas or something like that, you're going to qualify for in-state tuition. So there are a lot of incentives. There are more scholarships. Tuition is generally lower even for out-of-state students. So yeah, it's fascinating, and it's real. And of course, the downside to that is the admit rates at these, formally easier to get into schools have dropped. So they are no longer what we might call good bet or safety schools. They're
Any
getting
schools
harder
in
to get into.
particular you want to mention that fall into that category?
Oh, like University of Georgia, that like people used to do, oh, backup school. No way. No backup.
No.
Even schools like Auburn and University of South Carolina and certainly University of Florida and Florida State. I mean, my goodness, these are really hard to get into schools. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's ironic for Amy and me is that these schools that we're talking about are schools that were test mandatory very early in the pandemic cycle.
Right.
Today, students in the high school graduating class of 2026, it's really not a question of whether you're going to take tests. You really need to take tests and figure out if you can submit them. There are a lot of advantages that we're not going to cover, but it's just interesting that students from the Northeast, where many of the schools here have been slow to enforce those standards, I think that part of the reason that, say, the University of Georgia went test mandatory so soon was because there was a flood of students that wanted to go
Hmm.
and maybe take advantage of
Right.
the Hope Scholarship,
Right.
and they had to add more data points to make sure they were pulling in the right students.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of funny because you guys have watched those trends, from test optional back to testing. And, a lot of people might not like it, but it helps, it helps with those data points. So, all of us, of course, are in agreement. Take a test. It's
Yeah.
not that hard to find anymore.
No, for sure. Now, speaking of tests, there's a new old test
You will
on the
test.
horizon. The ACT is undergoing changes that are gently called enhancements. And we've covered that topic extensively on the podcast. We won't get into all the details, but one of the salient changes is that the science section of the ACT, will be considered optional. And it's optional from the perspective of ACT. They say take
Correct.
it or don't take it. What is your perspective, Rebecca, on whether the ACT science test is going to be mandatory for a lot of schools and or programs?
Right. I mean, a lot of, companies are tracking this. I'm sure you two are tracking this. And, the data is still slow to come in. Um, some schools have said, sure, it's optional. Some schools haven't stated. And so, I really don't know. I mean, I think we can all agree the science section, when I tell kids that it's not necessarily science per se, we're really interpreting data here. So do schools find that to be valuable? I think we have to stay tuned. I have my theories on why ACT has done this. I feel like ACT and SAT are kind of getting closer together, and they used to be quite distinct tests. So for now, my advice, quite frankly, is take the science section because, until you know for sure that every single school on your college list is not going to require it, do yourself a favor and take the
I
science
think
section.
what is really confusing, at least especially for us within the industry, is that we know there's a writing component that's optional. It's been optional We know that when they instituted the writing, we weren't sure either. So therefore, the recommendation for students was take the writing, take it seriously. And then, of course, that kind of dropped off. And now within test prep, you don't hear of anybody doing test prep for the writing portion of the ACT, despite the fact that it still exists. I think what we're trying to look at is that we see all these different testing policies, test required, we've got test optional, we've got test blind. So I think the thing that I'm sort of wrangling with is, like Mike said, ACT is making it optional. The question really on the part of colleges is if they were to say the science is optional, like the science is optional in taking, or an ACT is optional, that's a far different statement than we're test blind to science, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's the clarity that we would all love to see is when you say you're optional means you're not even going to look at my science score. And I think that's why the recommendation all of us will probably hold minimally, I think, for the next year, certainly for the class of 2027, is you must at least have at least one science so that you can use that if you need to.
Right. Because, and we all know that language of, test optional can mean a lot of different things at different schools, test preferred, even though it says test optional, they really prefer that test. And I'm looking at, Compass Prep's, website and of course, all the Florida colleges, it's advisable. That's what they're saying. So, advisable, well, what does that mean? Of course, you're going to take it. If it's going to help you, you should absolutely, absolutely take it. So, we're all on board with this until otherwise
So prove it differently.
Stated. Yes.
Yeah, take the science. Don't take the writing. Nobody wants the writing anymore. It's still an artifact of state testing because a lot of states that use the ACT as an assessment want that, but no school in the country will give you advantage if you submit a writing because they won't look at it. And so, the question is going to be, is it optional as in they won't look at it, or it's optional like if you take it, they will look at it, or is it mandatory? And we're still waiting on a lot of schools to inform the public about their policy for the class of 2026.
Yeah. And for 2026, pretty much all the kids are going to have a science score. If you tested in December, February, April, June, July, we know pretty overwhelmingly most of them took it on paper, which means there'd be a science score.
Yeah, but there's still some students that haven't yet, or they are choosing, if you take the enhanced test, it may be, I think that your science score carries with it, but if you're only submitting one, if you're not submitting to a super score school and you're submitting one test score and it's a September or an October enhanced test, it doesn't have to have science on it.
Right. But you are essentially competing against a cohort of students that predominantly would have tested when there was a science. So I look at the 2026ers we'll have it. But I think beyond that, that's where there's a question mark is what's going to happen.
It's a little frustrating for students, right?
Stay tuned for next year's high school admissions class of 2027 edition.
For sure.
So a lot of times, obviously you as a college advisor focus on helping students kind of build their lists. And we sometimes talk about building a balanced college list. Do you think that still holds true, that students need to build a balanced list for themselves?
Yeah, I think balanced lists are important. And, just a simple explanation of a balanced list is, you're going to have schools that are harder to get into, schools where you're right, in the middle, being competitive, and then schools that have higher admit rates that are easier to get into. But, as I'm observing this year in particular, that's not enough. So a balanced list certainly is great, but there is still something for many colleges called demonstrated interest. And, what do I mean by that? Well, there are colleges that track whether or not students are actually engaged and truly interested in applying to these specific schools. And I'll give you one example from this year. And I'm going to name the schools. So I had a student, who did, she was very thorough about her college list. And so two schools, that she applied to, one was Wheaton in Illinois, which is a private Christian university. And then the other was Northwestern University, also in Illinois. She ended up getting into Northwestern, which has an admit rate of about 6 or 7%. And she was denied at Wheaton, which has an 85% admit rate. So I can only assume that they didn't think that she was serious about
And they didn't want it to influence their
applying.
yield.
Exactly. It's all about the yield. And it was frustrating because it was a school that she was interested in. So, what's the lesson here? Yeah, find out if demonstrated interest matters. Engage with the college. Do visits. Email your representative. Go to, Google Common Data Set, the name of the school, and look at C7, and you'll be able to see whether or not that school tracks student engagement. So balanced college list, not quite enough.
Can you mention just really quickly, what are some of the things students can do to demonstrate interest, like some specific behaviors or things they can do?
Right. One of the things that I tell my students is even if you cannot visit a college, you can certainly email if you have a regional rep. A lot of schools will have regional reps from your area. And yeah, there's a lot of information on their website, but you can certainly, I was just talking to a student the other day, the student was looking for specific qualities, and I encouraged the student, email your rep, email admissions, ask these questions, introduce yourself. I shared a story of my eldest son, this is many years ago, had emailed Vanderbilt some questions and they jumped on him. They're like, yeah, let's have a conversation. And they set up a phone call with him, and he was admitted later. So, that's one way, literally, communication is something that I teach. You can certainly attend online webinars. If they come to your high school, you'll definitely want to attend and interact. Visiting is great. So all of those things, can matter. There are many ways to engage with colleges.
That's all great advice, Rebecca. Another thing that may or may not matter, and we're jumping around here, but I want to get in this question about calculus or statistics as an honors math course. Adam Tyner at Fordham Institute and some colleagues released a big white paper on the question. We're actually going to have him on the podcast to discuss it in depth, but
Wonderful.
I want to get your perspective as an admissions counselor, as an educational consultant. Do students have more freedom today to get off the calculus track if they want to show rigor in math by taking AP stats instead?
Right. And of course, the answer is yes and no. And it depends on the major, right? Obviously, I mean, I'm going to be honest, even if some really selective schools say, hey, it's all about context. And if you can't, get calculus, we're okay with that. But quite frankly, I really appreciate the schools like Georgia Tech that say, of course, and MIT, we want you to take calculus. If you're going into STEM, you need to take calculus. There are so many ways that you can have access to calculus, even if it's not offered at your high school, right? There are, online community college classes, there are open courseware. So I am firm, in the camp that says if you're going into any sort of STEM related field, calculus is still king. If you're not, if you're going into humanities majors, I think there is a lot more flexibility as long as you're showing strength in those areas that matter to your major.
Yeah, I think social sciences students are likely to go travel paths where they're going to need advanced statistics, where it's
Exactly.
actually a
Exactly.
benefit. If you're a poli-sci major, you're an economics major, something like that, statistics is valuable.
As
Right.
opposed to taking calculus,
As
right?
opposed,
Right.
only
Right.
because I think that statistics has more applicability to a citizen of the world.
Well, most
Yes.
disciplines,
If you're not in a specific STEM field, calculus won't help you much besides whereas
well, a lot of
statistics.
a lot of college majors make you take a statistics relevant to your, like my daughter's taking business statistics, and I think exposure is helpful. Um, I can comment that Case Western Reserve University's admissions people consistently tell me that when they're evaluating applications, that calculus is really important, like a real deal breaker.
Really? Okay.
Except, does your application read like a humanities major? So I give that advice to students where I say, look, if your entire high school, like, resume is I did like robotics and I did STEM stuff and I present like a STEM kid, they're going to expect calc because they're going to predict
Right.
that you're going to be a STEM kid. But if you're presenting like I would have presented in high school, which was like newspaper, theater, whatever. And what was I? I was a history major. That is where there's a little bit, but now that I've only heard that from Case, but I would say that's interesting that obviously there could be a distinction if in case you don't apply with a major. So they kind of have to predict what you're going to be. And they do that by looking at what is your historically,
Right.
what
And
have you
that
participated in?
absolutely. And that's my experience as a consultant. I was thinking about a student of mine who went to Yale, and the student got as high as pre-calculus. But that student's background was fully in humanities. The student was a professional actor. I mean, calculus was not needed for that direction. And I have another student, former student at UCLA, who went through, I almost think went through just algebra 2. So 3 years of high school math, but that student had like learned 4 languages, the student was studying Korean or something like that. So it
Or all
wasn't
their
relevant.
honors or
Yes,
APs are in the humanities where you're like, oh,
exactly.
you've signaled with every,
Exactly.
my kids all did like all the AP histories and social studies, right? So by my third
Exactly.
kid, I said, I don't care if you do calculus. And we predicted that in freshman year of high school.
Right.
And even when he got to college, he didn't have to even take calculus. So
Right.
I sort of held back on making my younger kids do the calc thing because I saw that like that's not your direction. And the college is going to recognize that, I think, on your application.
And the last thing I'll say is, if when in doubt, look at the possible future major you're looking at and look at, do they offer calculus? Then maybe it would be a good idea to get some exposure, like,
100%.
pre-med, or even business. Well, business will have business calculus. So it really, it behooves a student to sort of dig deeper into the actual major where they're headed. I think that's helpful.
I agree.
We've covered a lot, Rebecca. Are there any final points that you feel the graduating high school class of 2026 should be aware of regarding admissions trends?
I think research is really important, when building a college list. And, I'm going to, tout my profession and say that it really is beneficial to work with someone, whether it's your school counselor, an independent counselor, a testing pro, just to really do research and understand thoroughly what the admissions requirements are. Because we have touched on a lot of points today, but I think they're all really relevant. So I think it's important to stay on top of trends. For my students, just passing along really good, valuable information like this will be very beneficial for them, just to have their best shot, to be able to go in confidently and not, worry that they've missed something. So I think that's my, biggest point of advice is, stay up to date on trends. So listen to tests and the rest, listen to this podcast.
That is some excellent advice. All right. Well, obviously, we could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us again, Rebecca.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be back, and I'm sure I'll be back next year.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, they can just reach out to my website, orlowskiconsulting.com, or they can email me at rebecca@orlowskiconsulting.com.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Test and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Test and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.